G'day friends and fans, I'm the author David Applegate, author of the book The Boyhood of Cade, book 1 of the Empire of Elves, and welcome to Writing Corner 34, World Building, Part 1, Introduction. Now this channel is sponsored by people like you, the viewing audience. After the show, please check out the links in the description. My book links are in my link tree. You can buy coffee mugs and other fine items in my store. And of course, I have a Patreon. It has a 7-day free trial. Check it out. Now, of course, if you like the content, give me a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, please subscribe now on with the show. And I think a lot of people may actually know what world building is, but may not actually understand all the basics. It's actually a process of not just naming and describing parts of your world, although overall that is pretty much 99% of it. But it's more than that. It is a template for your story. It is an unfolding story into itself. Well, that doesn't mean you go into everything at once. But if you're a writer of fantasy, science fiction, and to some extent horror, you need some rules to your world. Now, of course, if you're doing contemporary stories, it's fairly easy. Now, with the basics, you have, of course, the name of your world and the type of setting. Now, with the setting, is it an Earth or alternate Earth or another planet? So then, of course, you have the time period and population, and in one sentence, describe your world. That starts you off right there. But of course, that's just the basics. There's multiple chapters. You're going to do geography, and that breaks down into the natural world, significant locations, and weather. Then you have the people, the races of your world, the languages they speak, their social frameworks. Then you're going to go into civilization, history, culture, religion, leisure, education. And of course, you have technology, magic, and weapons. We have, of course, that magic system, which I have touched on before, but I will touch on again, along with technology and weaponry. And then you have part 6, economy, part 7, politics. Now, there's also possibly, I'm working on a part 8, where we actually go into factions that that may actually be a separate section altogether. So I might do 7 parts in all over the next 7 weeks. I'll do a video on each part of world building. I'll touch on magic again. Then, of course, I will do factions and deal with that. And of course, the basics is very short. It's the shortest part. This is your beginning. This is where you are defining the start. With every journey, of course, you start with a few basic steps. Now, when you describe your world in one sentence, of course, this is more like 25 words or less. Could be fairly simple. It could be the homeworld of the elves or the new home of the elves. It could be a fantasy realm of humans and non-humans, or a fantasy realm of non-humans. You can go back and redefine. Every stage is not set in stone until you've reached the end. And I suggest with world building, you don't do this on the fly, although you are going to find yourself doing it on the fly, even best intentions, but of course, the first casualty of any project is the plans. As you're writing the book, you may have better ideas. As you're going along, you may redefine your world. There's no hard and fast rules that says you have to do it all at once or at all if you're that inclined to pants instead of plot. I suggest you do at least some world building when you're a fantasy writer. Of course, this is why established IPs are more popular right now, because their realms are more known. Harry Potter, urban fantasy, took you have again very simplistic world building with the fantasy of the Hunger Games. A lot of YA, very basic. Now, of course, the further you get away, it's sort of like a lot of in-between fantasies didn't work. They're either contemporary or Tolkien-esque, although admittedly the failures recently of some shows do show that even that there's no absolute guarantee, but most shows who failed are actually in the middle. Because fans of Tolkien go to the Tolkien-esque, and fans of contemporary go to the contemporary, and the two don't meet in the middle. So this comes down to knowing your audience. You either try to make it as contemporary as possible to a broader audience, or as Tolkien-esque as possible to appeal to the established fantasy audience. It's like science fiction. A lot of people think Star Wars is science fiction. It's not. It's science fantasy, but and it's the same. Most superhero stuff is actually contemporary fantasy. But horror used to be actually a genre of fantasy, I think, up until Mary Shelley, although I think because Frankenstein really propelled fantasy to the forefront, although it also, I think, gave birth to grimdark. Of course, as a lot of people think, horror wasn't really born then. Horror did exist. It's just that horror never really mainstreamed. It's the same with grimdark. It's the same with although possibly Henry Cavill could propel grimdark into the mainstream, but often I think the world building, the better people can identify with that world. That, I think, is where a lot of shows failed and a lot of books failed. Look at the world building with Game of Thrones. It was extremely detailed and worked into everything. And a lot of people would complain, normally, show don't tell, yet Game of Thrones was pretty much wearing everything on your sleeve. It's the same with Harry Potter. It's the same with even Tolkien. You don't see the history, you're told the history. It is amazing how a lot of this, even the stuff with Chekhov's gun and all this stuff, all these rules you keep getting told, well, most of the most popular works break the rules. Now, a lot of people will say, oh, why don't you just do more, give us a breakdown of good and bad writing, like why is Harry Potter baby food? Why is Mortal Engines a failure? Well, Mortal Engines didn't fail as a book. It failed as a movie, and it failed because it didn't adhere to the source material, and it didn't introduce the world building. It just said, here, you're fans of this show, like it or not. I don't know why Peter Jackson didn't do any world building, and but there's a lot of things. We've seen reboots work in the past. We've seen remakes work in the past. We've seen sequels work in the past. I think today you're going to encounter more and more criticism. So the more world building you have, and the more practice you have, and the more understanding you have of your world, I think you'll actually understand why you need to explain. And the problem is, a lot of stuff is explained in by telling the reader, because they think, oh, people aren't going to discuss. Oh, you're always going to have well, in Harry Potter it was Harry Potter himself, but I'm trying to think, like Batman explaining to Robin, Superman didn't and that interaction with Lois Lane, Clark Kent and Lois Lane, the Superman, remember, Superman didn't wear a mask. Clark Kent was the mask, but he grew up, and so he didn't. He was, of course, I think the unfolding of his backstory, because there was so little to it, was very quick and easy. And plus it was another contemporary fantasy, so it really didn't have to explain much. I'm trying to think of another world building that I had just on before with a more Tolkien-esque world building, very detailed. Although I'm thinking of Dune as well in science fiction. It is probably the best of world building in science fiction, where people actually go discuss the history. Proper discussions of the history. Dune is one of those shows you can't do as a movie. You have to do as a series. I honestly think that one of the reasons why a lot of comic book movies work today but failed in the past is because enough people knew now, whereas back then they were poorly made, poorly presented, and rather amateurish in their productions, whereas today they're polished, but they have very little world building. And a lot of them are just character introductions. And once people introduce you to the character, they lose interest in that character very shortly. It's so the more world building and the more, I mean, you look at Harry Potter, you look at how it's dropped off very quickly. Hasn't quite reached critical mass yet, but it's down to its hardcore fans again, which happens. Tolkien waxes and wanes in popularity. Superheroes wax and wane in popularity. You look at westerns. Once upon a time, I think reached one point where 6 out of 10 shows on at the in that 6 out of the top 10 shows were all westerns or something like that. It got that. Yet you look at the golden age of theatre. There were actually less westerns in movies than there were TV shows. Most of your westerns were TV shows. A lot of your long-running TV shows are westerns. Now they're police dramas, and then it's actually evolving to spy dramas. Though they've yet to reach that length of time. But I mean, once upon a time, the only really long-running show, after once there was this whole period of television, the dark years of television, where shows were being cancelled all the time, were only lasting a few years. The only long-run dramas were soap operas. Why? Short attention spans, lack of world building in other TV shows. You may think contemporary urban fantasies don't need world building, but they still need character introductions. You still need introductions to organizations. So really, if you are making anything more complex than a single detective mystery where you're using organizations familiar to people, you have to establish rules, structures, organizations, who's in them. You're going to really have a cast herd to manage. A lot of people, this is what made some detectives really, really stand out, is that they did it just stand over the body and be a know-it-all. That's why Sherlock Holmes, a lot of the Sherlock Holmes always fail. They eventually people get bored of them. Um, more long-running series as you look at them, they have forensic experts, psychology experts, computer experts, interrogators, or just the muscle who can chase people down, or the brains of the operation who knows who to send what to where and when, and to figure out the solution. Teams work better than individuals in the long term. In the short term, yes, you'll get an individual like Harry Potter popular in the short term, but in the long term, teams work better. So know your audience and build the world appropriate to the audience. So whether it's contemporary fantasy, Tolkien fantasy, or mythology. There's multiple fantasies, there's multiple science fictions, science fantasy. What you want to write in, know the trope. To know your audience is to know the tropes. I haven't got to tropes yet. Maybe I should have done tropes before this, but you never know. Well, I think world building is important, and then once you polish your world and organizations, then you're going to do tropes. That's my interpretation. Others, then of course you've got tropes, characters. So got a lot to cover. And thank you for listening, and I'll see you all in the next video.